trajectory of the Tibetan diaspora. Let's see. I think that's all. So that's all for that. Yes. And I think I'll just read a couple. Mrs. Jordan Kangsar. So I met her in 1991. She was one of my first interviews, and really I thought about her story and her experience for many years. I met her at the Dalai Lama's birthday in Zurich. There's a large population of Tibetans in Switzerland, like at least 3,000. So I met her there, and my translator, who is a friend from Dharamsala, and I went out to a suburb on a train to interview her a few days later. But what I thought was a little unusual was that her husband sat down during the interview with me. And I sort of tried to drop hints, you know, that it was a book about Tibetan women, but he said, okay. Kind of sat there. So they lived an hour's horseback ride northwest of Lhasa, and he had been a very wealthy landowner. He owned a lot of tracts of land, and married her sister to try to produce a male heir to inherit his land. So that didn't work. She had a couple miscarriages, and then he married her, who was the younger sister, and she had a son. And then the first wife, you know, 14 years later had a son. So I'll start here. I call them Mola and Bola, which is grandmother or grandfather. I asked Mola if she'd been in town in March '59, the critical month when the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, invaded Lhasa and the Dalai Lama fled into exile. She nodded. The Chinese had been there for many years, she said. They gave interest-free loans to the needy, built roads, said they were there to help develop the area. She spoke in a low mumble. Nothing like Tibetan women I knew, light-hearted and easy to laugh. In 1959, she said, when townspeople realized the Chinese were seriously taking control, they rejoiced. Bola nodded in agreement. They were jubilant. Why? I asked, shocked and surprised. What were they happy about? She explained, the Chinese had promised for years that under their governance, taxes would be abolished and debts forgiven. The local population was mostly poor tenant farmers, as she and her family had been, and many carried crushing debt. The Chinese also promised land and wealth would be redistributed fairly and equally. Bola interjected. He said, I'd ridden to Lhasa that week on business. I saw the troops, thousands of Chinese troops, marching in formation through town. I saw machine guns and cannons and tanks and jeeps. I remember it was a full moon. I thought, it is really happening. The Chinese are taking the country. I heard in town that once they took Lhasa, they planned to use it. He raised his hand and drew a circle in the air, like the hub of a wheel. They planned to push out in every direction, to take the whole country. I rode back home to get my family, he said. We had to leave. We could only hope to escape with our lives. We didn't have time to take anything. But first I stopped at the Rinpoche's house. I thought I'd take him with us. Who's the Rinpoche? I interrupted. Dorje exchanged some words with Bola. As the family had large land holdings, they knew they'd be prime targets from the communists. Dorje explained his best friend was the Rinpoche of the local monastery. He would also be targeted because the monastery owned lots of land. He asked me to come in for tea. I had tea with the Rinpoche, Bola continued. He was talking. A lot. He shook his head, puzzled. I didn't know what he was talking about. He went on such a long time. Finally, I rode home. Tea was often a very formal occasion in Tibet. Highly placed monastics, such as Rinpoches, had so much clout that one could hardly decline an invitation to tea. Everyone deferred to them. On his horse racing home, Bola explained, it suddenly struck him what the Rinpoche had been saying. He would not travel with women. He said that, I asked? Not exactly. I knew Tibetans in polite society never directly refused or made imposing requests. Everything was indirect. This saved face for all. Why was that? Was it against his monastic vows? Bola shrugged. Mola looked on silently. His ordination vows? He shrugged again. Did he not get along with your wives? Or was it a practical reason? He shook his head. I don't know, he murmured. You never found out? No. But it was clear. You mean that's why he kept you for tea? He nodded, slowly. The Rinpoche had made his views firmly known by holding forth at formal tea. The full implication of this started to dawn on me. So you had to decide between saving your wives and saving the Rinpoche? He shook his head, lips pulled tight, gazing into space. A chill crept up my spine. Not to aid a high incarnation such as a Rinpoche would draw tremendous negative merit or karmic consequences in Tibetan Buddhist thinking. He could not abandon a Rinpoche to what would be certain suffering and maybe death at the hands of people who considered religion poison. He could not save both his wives and the Rinpoche. I'm just going to read this one chapter. So, I'll just read this one paragraph. In Mrs. Namsaling's account, Lhasa was a city of women. In Mrs. Jordan Kongsar's slave gulags, she eventually was left behind with her sister and put in a slave gulag, were made up predominantly of women. Both took for granted that women's participation in government affairs was something that just wasn't done. I felt I had known modern history, I had studied, I'd been an activist, I kept my ear to the ground, but I was starting to unpeel an invisible layer of history. In Tibet, they had a saying that men were the pillars inside the house, the home, and women the pillars, In Tibet, they had a saying that men were the pillars outside the house, and women the pillars inside the home. This translated to men handling trading and business, while women took care of family and hearth. Men had wide freedom of movement all over the region. They practically lived on the trail. Some had left like Mr. Jordan Kongsar to join the resistance. The privileged, who knew they would suffer under a communist system, landowners, high-ranking lamas, and aristocrats fled. Years later, as I worked on this book in America after the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina, people posed a similar question. Who got to leave? And who got left behind? I suddenly saw the occupation in a new light. Who, I asked, really suffered in Tibet? The face was changing. Thank you.
Thank you, Canyon Sam. I'm in the middle of reading your book, Skytrain, and I must add that I find it a very fascinating account of Tibetan women. And the reason why I personally liked it was because some of the Tibetan women the book talked about are lesser known personalities. So on that account, I thought it was quite a tribute to, His Holiness the Dalai Lama's aspiration that, given all things being equal, this is a Chinese Chinese person's sort of take on the Tibetan issue, and it is full of real empathy. So that is pretty heartwarming, I think.